Her billionaire husband gave his mistress her voting proxy. She resigned from his board. A voting proxy slid across the boardroom table and stopped inches from Camille Everhart's hand. The paper was crisp, white, and cruel, carrying her name in one column, and Bianca Fairchild's name in the space, where Camille's voice had been stolen. Camille sat in a vivid red power dress, the only color in a room built to make women like her look temporary, while Preston Blackwell watched, from the head of the table in an elegant black suit, and Bianca sat in Camille's board seat wearing a soft white dress that made her look fragile enough to be protected and smug enough to be dangerous. Around them, merger partners, corporate attorneys, senior bankers, and voting directors pretended not to stare as the truth became public. The wife who had built the risk logic behind Blackwell Meridian Capital had just been stripped of her vote in front of the very people who had profited from her mind. Camille did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She opened the leather folder in front of her, took out a pen, and began writing her resignation by hand. For 7 seconds, no one moved. The room seemed to understand, before Preston did, that something irreversible had begun. The annual merger vote was supposed to be his triumph, the final approval of a $4.8 billion acquisition that would make Blackwell Meridian Capital the most aggressive private investment house on the East Coast. For months, Preston had stood in front of cameras calling it his vision, his instinct, his conquest, while Camille quietly rebuilt the entire risk model after midnight, corrected the debt exposure tables, and warned him 3 times that the acquisition only worked if the liquidity corridor held above 12.6%. He had smiled through every warning, as if patience from a brilliant woman were the same thing as permission to ignore her. Now the proxy lay on the table like a public insult dressed in legal language. "Camille," Preston said, his voice low, polished, and meant to control the temperature of the room. "This is procedural. Bianca will vote in alignment with the strategic position we discussed." Bianca's fingers rested on the edge of the proxy folder. Her smile was small, almost gentle, but her eyes had the pleased stillness of someone sitting in a chair she had not earned and mistaking access for authority. Camille looked at her once, then looked back at Preston, not as a wife looking at her husband, as an analyst measuring catastrophic exposure. The lead counsel cleared his throat and said the proxy had been validated by executive authorization. A director, near the windows, shifted uncomfortably. One of the bankers looked down at his tablet. They all knew. They knew Camille's models had saved this company during the Austin credit freeze, the Phoenix logistics collapse, and the failed Harborline acquisition. Preston had nearly signed blind. They knew her silence had been mistaken for support, her discretion for weakness, and her loyalty for something they could keep spending without cost. Camille finished writing. Her handwriting was steady. The resignation was only 4 sentences, but each one landed, with more force than an accusation. She resigned from the board effective immediately. She withdrew from all advisory participation in the merger vote. She reserved all rights relating to independently developed quantitative risk architecture, liquidity forecasting systems, and proprietary valuation models. She requested formal separation of all intellectual property within 30 business days. Preston's face changed for the first time. Not much. Just enough for the men beside him to see fear break through the expensive calm. "You do not want to do this here," he said. Camille capped her pen. "You chose here." Then she pushed the paper across the table, not toward the secretary, not toward counsel, but directly toward Preston. The resignation stopped beside the proxy, 2 documents facing each other like a marriage certificate and a death notice. Bianca's smile faded by a fraction. Camille rose from her chair, red against black suits, red against white silk, red against a room that had believed it could take her vote and still keep her mind. She picked up only her folder, leaving behind the printed merger deck she had corrected line by line. At the door, Preston said her name again, softer this time, because he had finally heard the cost inside it. Camille turned halfway back. "If my vote belongs to someone else," she said, calm enough to make the room colder, "then my mind does too." And then she walked out, before the most important vote of Preston Blackwell's life could begin. Camille did not hurry after she left the boardroom. That was what made the silence behind her feel so expensive. She walked down the private corridor of Blackwell Meridian Capital with the same controlled grace she had used for 5 years, while fixing Preston's mistakes before they reached investors, regulators, or the front page of a financial paper. Behind the glass wall, the boardroom remained frozen in a performance of dignity, but Camille knew the arithmetic had already changed. Preston still had his merger vote. Bianca still had her borrowed proxy. The directors still had their leather chairs and bottled water and polished legal phrases. But the company no longer had the woman who understood where the real risk was buried. At the executive reception desk, Camille removed her access card from the slim red leather case she carried and placed it beside the visitor log. The young assistant looked up, startled, but Camille gave her a calm nod, the kind that told a person not to ask questions they would later regret hearing answered. Please inform legal that I want a complete archive of all IP assignment records, model development logs, source attribution files, and board advisory minutes sent to my counsel by 5 p.m. Eastern, Camille said. Her voice did not tremble. That was the first thing people remembered about her later. Not the dress. Not the resignation. The voice. It sounded like a door closing from the inside. Downstairs, the lobby of the tower was full of polished marble, private security, and men speaking into phones as if volume could manufacture importance. Camille stepped through them untouched. Only when she reached the back seat of the black car waiting outside did her fingers tighten around the fountain pen she had used to sign the resignation. It was a dark green Montblanc Preston had given her 7 years earlier, before the first fund, before the magazine covers, before he learned to call her brilliant in private and supportive in public. Back then, he had told her that one day they would build something no one could erase. Now the same pen had helped her erase herself from his board before he could reduce her to a silent asset. That night, in her apartment overlooking Lower Manhattan, Camille placed the pen on the kitchen counter and stood still for a long time. The city glittered beneath her, all steel, glass, and ambition. And for the first time in years, no one was waiting for her to repair a spreadsheet, calm an investor, or translate Preston's arrogance into strategy. A single tear slid down her cheek before she could stop it. She did not wipe it away immediately. She let it exist. She let herself mourn the marriage, the illusion, the younger woman who had believed loyalty would be recognized if it was elegant enough. Then she opened her laptop. By midnight, 3 law firms had received encrypted folders from Camille Everhart. One contained timestamps proving when she first developed Blackwell Meridian's liquidity stress engine. One contained early code repositories registered under her personal consulting entity before Preston's company ever touched them. One contained handwritten notes from meetings where board members had asked her to quietly review transactions that Preston had publicly claimed as his own instincts. At 8:17 the next morning, Preston's outside counsel received a courier envelope. Inside was Camille's wedding ring, sealed in a small black evidence pouch, along with an invoice for 5 years of unpaid strategic advisory labor calculated at senior partner rates. There was no emotional letter, no accusation, no plea, only a line at the bottom of the invoice, payment due upon receipt. When Preston saw it, he laughed once, too sharply, because anger was easier than fear. But the laughter died when his lawyer turned the second page and found the notice of intellectual property separation. Every model Camille owned would be withdrawn from Blackwell Meridian's active systems within 30 business days. Every derivative use would require licensing. Every unauthorized deployment would trigger legal action. Preston stared at the document, as if the paper itself had betrayed him. Across the room, Bianca stood in her white dress from the board meeting, quieter than usual now, watching the man who had handed her a vote discover that he had given away the only person who knew what that vote was worth. You see, this is the part of the story where some people make the mistake of thinking Camille Everhart was cold. She was not cold. She was disciplined. There is a difference, and it matters. A cold person feels nothing. A disciplined person feels everything, then refuses to let the people who wounded her use that feeling as evidence that she is weak. Preston Blackwell had not merely betrayed his wife with Bianca Fairchild. That would have been ordinary cruelty the kind wealthy men sometimes try to bury under private apologies and public donations. What he did was sharper. He tried to take Camille's professional voice, the one thing she had earned, through years of calculation, late-night revisions, and silent rescues, and hand it to a woman whose confidence came from proximity, not competence. Tell me, what kind of arrogance does it take to believe you can transfer a woman's vote without losing her mind with it? Preston believed power lived in documents, because documents had always favored him. Board appointments, proxy authorizations, executive signatures, press releases with his name in bold. He had built an entire public identity on paper authority, and for a while, the world rewarded him for it. But paper authority is fragile when it depends on invisible labor. It looks impressive until the person doing the actual thinking stands up and leaves. That is why Camille's silence frightened him more than rage ever could. If she had shouted, he could have called her emotional. If she had cried in front of the board, he could have called her unstable. If she had begged for her seat back, he could have made the betrayal look like a misunderstanding between spouses under pressure. But she gave him none of those exits. She gave him procedure. She gave him notice. She gave him an invoice. And that is why the room shifted. Because everyone watching understood that Camille was not reacting to humiliation. She was pricing it. Bianca, too, was part of a psychology we need to name clearly. She wanted the visible symbols of Camille's life. The board seat, the private access, the right to sit near Preston while powerful men listened. But she mistook symbols for substance. A white dress can suggest innocence. A borrowed vote can suggest importance. A chair at the table can suggest authority. None of those things create judgment. None of them teach you how to read a liquidity trap hidden inside a glamorous merger deck. None of them give you the courage to say no to a billionaire when the numbers prove he is wrong. And that is where Camille's power becomes almost frightening. She did not need revenge to be loud, because she understood consequence. She knew Preston's empire had been living on a quiet subsidy. Her intelligence, her restraint, her pattern recognition, her willingness to save him from himself without embarrassing him in public. Once that subsidy ended, the market would do what markets always do. It would expose the lie. So when Camille sent that ring back through counsel with a 5-year invoice, it was not petty. It was a psychological reversal. She was telling Preston, in the only language men like him respect, that love had been converted into labor, labor had been converted into enterprise value, and enterprise value now had a bill attached. That is the elegance of her awakening. She did not ask the world to feel sorry for her. She forced the world to audit what it had taken from her. And maybe that is the question worth sitting with for a moment. If someone tried to take your voice and give it to someone else, would you spend your life begging them to recognize your worth, or would you become so precise, so legally protected, and so undeniable that recognition arrived as a financial obligation? Camille's first meeting with her legal team took place at 7:40 a.m. in a quiet midtown office where the conference room had no flowers, no skyline theatrics, and no tolerance for emotional confusion. She arrived in a tailored red sheath dress beneath a camel coat, carrying a slim black portfolio, 3 encrypted drives, and a handwritten chronology of every model she had built before Blackwell Meridian Capital had learned how to profit from her judgment. Across the table sat 2 intellectual property attorneys, a corporate separation specialist, a forensic accounting partner, and a former Securities and Exchange Commission enforcement counsel who had reviewed the first folder before sunrise and said only one sentence. He underestimated the wrong asset. Camille did not ask them to ruin Preston. She asked them to identify ownership, document misuse, protect derivative rights, and stop the company from treating her mind like marital property. That distinction mattered. Revenge wanted heat. Camille wanted enforceability. By 9:15 a.m., the team had mapped the battlefield into 4 clean categories. Algorithms created before her formal executive advisory role, models adapted under limited internal license, board materials bearing her unattributed risk corrections, and derivative systems Blackwell Meridian could no longer operate without triggering exposure. Preston's first counterattack arrived before lunch. His attorneys sent a restrictive notice claiming that Camille's work had been absorbed into corporate infrastructure that any external use would violate confidentiality obligations, and that her departure created a material risk to the merger process. 10 minutes later, a second letter followed, freezing access to a joint investment account worth $18.3 million until marital and corporate matters were resolved. By 1:06 p.m. A third demand arrived. Preston wanted Camille to sign a non-compete agreement, a non-disparagement clause, and an expanded NDA that would prevent her from advising any institution evaluating distressed assets connected to Blackwell Meridian. Camille read all three documents without changing expression. Then she placed them side by side and circled the same word in each letter: prohibited. It fascinated her how men like Preston always called a woman's independence a threat once her silence stopped serving them. For years, he had presented her calculations as married teamwork when they made him richer. Now he called those same calculations confidential weapons because they might make her free. Her lead attorney, Mara St. John, a silver-haired woman with the calm posture of someone who had dismantled louder men for longer than Camille had been in finance, looked over her glasses and said, "He is not trying to win the case today. He is trying to scare you before you remember how much paper you kept." Camille opened the first encrypted drive. Inside were original code repositories dated years before the merger strategy, timestamped notebooks from her personal consulting entity, archived emails in which Preston asked her to take a quiet look before board meetings, and draft risk engines labeled in her own naming convention, not the company's. There were voice memos from late-night review sessions, meeting invitations that excluded her from official credit, but included her in emergency decision-making, and marked-up debt models showing her handwritten corrections beneath Preston's public initials. The room went still as the evidence built itself into a wall. Camille was not claiming ownership from memory. She was proving it by metadata. At 3:30 p.m., Mara sent Blackwell Meridian a formal preservation demand, an IP separation notice, and a licensing schedule for any continued use of Camille's quantitative risk architecture. The notice gave the company 30 business days to remove her systems from active deployment or enter paid licensing negotiations at market premium rates. It also warned that any attempt to alter, delete, conceal, or rebrand her work would be treated as evidence of willful misuse. Preston called her directly at 4:12 p.m. Camille let it ring once, twice, 3 times, then declined and forwarded the missed call screenshot to counsel. She had spent years answering him before he finished needing her. That habit ended here. At 5 p.m., just as she had demanded, Blackwell Meridian's own legal archive began arriving in batches. The files were messy, arrogant, and useful. One board memo described her as informal support, then attached a 47-page model she had written alone. One executive summary praised Preston's instinctive risk discipline, then embedded her risk thresholds in the appendix. One merger deck removed her name, but left her formulas untouched. Camille read until the city outside turned dark blue. For the first time since the boardroom, she smiled. Not warmly, not softly, precisely. Preston had tried to cage her with contracts. She answered with ownership. Camille signed the lease for Everhart Risk Atelier on a Tuesday morning, not in a tower built for spectacle, but on the 27th floor of a quiet limestone building, where the elevators moved smoothly, the windows faced the city without begging for attention, and the conference rooms had walls thick enough to protect serious conversations. She did not want a company that looked like Preston's empire in a smaller size. She wanted a place built around precision, attribution, and judgment no one could quietly steal. The name on the temporary glass door was printed in plain black letters, and for several seconds Camille stood in front of it without moving. Everhart Risk Atelier. Not Blackwell. Not a division. Not informal support. Hers. By 8:20 a.m., she was inside, with a folding table, 1 laptop, 3 monitors, a secure server cabinet, and a legal firewall that separated every line of new architecture from anything Blackwell Meridian could challenge. She would not touch Preston's client data. She did not need to. The thresholds, the stress logic, the liquidity patterns, and the original architecture had always been hers, and now she was rebuilding them cleaner, stronger, and beyond his reach. Her first hires were not flashy names from magazine lists. They were people who knew what invisible competence cost. Dana Wycliffe, a former forensic accountant, who could find a hidden liability in a footnote faster than most executives could read a summary. Imani Cross, a data scientist who had left a hedge fund after watching her models presented under a managing director's name. Ruth Bellamy, a compliance attorney with a soft voice and a terrifying memory for regulatory language. Martin Keene, a former bank risk officer who had once warned a board about a liquidity trap and been told he was too cautious 6 months before the trap closed. Camille interviewed each person herself. She did not ask whether they were loyal. She asked whether they were precise. Within 2 weeks, the office began to sound alive in the way serious work sounds alive. Keyboards at midnight, low voices around whiteboards, coffee cooling beside annotated term sheets, formulas revised because good enough was still too expensive when billions of dollars were involved. Camille worked harder than she had at Blackwell Meridian, but the exhaustion felt different. No one was using her brilliance to polish Preston's image. No one was turning her warnings into his instincts. When a model worked, the analyst's name stayed attached to it. When a report went out, credit traveled with the labor. That became her first internal rule, written in the employee handbook before the firm had more than 6 people. No work leaves this office without attribution. Across town, Bianca Fairchild began attending risk meetings in Camille's former orbit, still wearing white, still carrying herself like someone waiting to be admired before being questioned. But admiration thinned quickly when the work became real. In one meeting, she confused volatility with liquidity. In another, she approved a summary that ignored rollover exposure in a debt stack tied to 3 warehouse properties outside Newark. Preston corrected her once, sharply, then softened his tone when the CFO looked up. The performance was beginning to crack. Bianca could sit in Camille's chair, but she could not hear the warning buried inside a clean number. Meanwhile, Camille's new team completed its first independent liquidity stress engine at 2:13 a.m. on a rain-dark Thursday, and when the final simulation ran, the room went quiet. The model identified failure points not as isolated problems, but as behavioral patterns: executive overconfidence, delayed disclosure, weak collateral discipline, and boardroom optimism masquerading as strategy. Camille stared at the results and understood that this was more than a business. It was a language for catching expensive lies before they became public disasters. Their first client arrived through Mara St. John, a private bank that needed a confidential review of a distressed manufacturing portfolio. Camille delivered the report in 9 days. It saved the bank from a $74 million exposure. After that, referrals began moving through the kind of circles Preston used to dominate: discreet lenders, family offices, insurance funds, restructuring counsel. No press, no applause, just calls from people who had learned that Camille Everhart did not decorate risk. She revealed it. One evening, long after her team had gone home, Camille stood alone beside the office window in the same red dress she had worn to a client meeting and looked down at Manhattan's grid of lights. She thought of the boardroom, the proxy, the way Preston's face had changed when she stopped being available. Then she turned back to the whiteboard, picked up a marker, and wrote the firm's first principle across the top: never confuse access with intelligence. By the time the city began whispering her name, Camille had already built the room where her mind could never be handed away again. By the end of the third quarter, Everhart Risk Atelier was no longer being whispered about as Camille's recovery project. It was being discussed in the rooms where people stopped performing wealth and started protecting it. The firm did not advertise on glossy billboards, sponsor galas, or release dramatic founder statements to the press. Its reputation traveled through quieter channels: a European pension fund that avoided a $620 million exposure because Camille's model detected covenant stress 6 weeks before the rating agencies did. A private bank in Boston that rewrote its entire collateral policy after her team found a liquidity cliff hidden inside a beautiful acquisition deck. A Gulf-based infrastructure fund that delayed a port logistics purchase after Camille proved the projected cash flow depended on 3 assumptions no serious lender would defend under oath. Every recommendation was cold, exact, and impossible to dismiss. That was how real power returned to her, not as applause, but as reliance. Camille still wore red to important meetings, but the color had changed meaning. At Blackwell Meridian, red had made her visible inside a room that wanted her useful but quiet. At Everhart Risk Atelier, red became a signature, a warning, and a standard. When she walked into a conference room at Aldwych Federal Trust for her first formal presentation to senior restructuring officers, no one mistook her for decoration, support, or someone's wife. They opened their notebooks before she sat down. They listened before she spoke. The presentation lasted 42 minutes. Camille mapped out a distressed asset portfolio across manufacturing warehouses, private credit obligations, and commercial property notes, then showed how 3 apparently unrelated defaults were actually tied to the same over-leveraged guarantor network. She did not raise her voice. She did not decorate the analysis with drama. She simply placed the truth on the screen and let the numbers humiliate every optimistic forecast in the room. When she finished, the bank's managing director, a gray-haired man known for interrupting billionaires mid-sentence, sat back and said, "Ms. Everhart, we would like your firm on retainer." Camille nodded once. "Then you will receive our terms by close of business." It was the kind of sentence Preston used to say for her, back when he believed authority meant speaking first. Now, authority meant being the person others waited for. Within weeks, her firm expanded from 12 people to 31, and she insisted on an internal rule that no analyst's work would be presented without attribution. Names mattered. Credit mattered. No one at her company would become invisible in order to make someone else look instinctive. That rule became part of the culture, then part of the mythology. Senior women from hedge funds, overlooked risk officers from banks, former compliance attorneys, and data scientists tired of being called technical support began sending resumes through private referrals. Camille did not hire people because they were wounded. She hired them because they were sharp, disciplined, and done shrinking themselves for rooms that confused arrogance with leadership. Meanwhile, the financial press finally noticed. A business journal described Everhart Risk Atelier as the boutique firm quietly correcting Wall Street's most expensive blind spots. Camille refused 3 television interviews, declined 2 magazine profiles, and accepted only 1 closed-door invitation, a private roundtable of institutional lenders discussing the future of distressed asset valuation. She entered that room without Preston's name attached to hers, without his company behind her, without his shadow filling the doorway. And still, the most powerful people in the room turned toward her. That was the moment she understood the shape of her freedom. She had not escaped Blackwell Meridian to become loud. She had escaped to become exact. Late that evening, after the roundtable ended, Camille stood alone in her new office and looked at the city lights reflecting against the glass. The same skyline had watched her cry over a fountain pen months earlier. Now it reflected a woman who had kept the scar, kept the lesson, and discarded the need to be chosen by anyone who benefited from underestimating her. Her phone buzzed with a message from Mara St. John. "Aldwych Federal Trust wants us for a major restructuring review. Possible conflict, Blackwell Meridian collateral exposure." Camille read it twice, then placed the phone face down. By the time they learned her name, she had already priced their future. At Blackwell Meridian Capital, the collapse did not arrive like a scandal. It arrived like a spreadsheet that refused to balance. At first, Preston told the board that Camille's departure was a temporary disruption, an emotional overcorrection, a legal inconvenience that would be resolved once everyone remembered who controlled the company. He said it from the head of the same boardroom table where he had handed Bianca Fairchild a borrowed vote, still wearing his elegant black suit, still using the calm baritone that had once convinced investors to mistake certainty for competence. But without Camille's risk architecture, certainty became expensive. The merger that had looked elegant in Preston's presentation began cracking under basic stress tests. A logistics subsidiary carried more debt than the acquisition deck admitted. A commercial property bundle depended on lease renewals that were already failing. A private credit line had hidden cross-default triggers that Camille would have flagged in the first 20 minutes. But Bianca signed off on the summary because the language sounded confident, and the room expected her to look useful. By Monday, one lender requested clarification. By Wednesday, two merger partners asked for revised exposure tables. By Friday at 4:23 p.m., Aldwych Federal Trust demanded additional collateral before releasing the next financing tranche. Preston reacted the way men like him react when reality stops flattering them. He blamed counsel. He blamed market conditions. He blamed transition risk and data migration. In private, he blamed Camille, though he never admitted that blaming her was the same as confessing how much he still needed her. His attorneys filed aggressive motions challenging her IP separation notice, claiming that her models had become inseparable from Blackwell Meridian's operations. Mara St. John answered with time-stamped repositories, board memos, and licensing records, so clean that even Preston's own legal team began advising settlement. He refused. He believed refusal was strength. Camille had always known it was often just panic in a better suit. Bianca tried to perform confidence at first. She attended every emergency meeting in white, with a folder full of printed summaries and a face arranged into calm attention. But the language kept moving past her. Counterparty exposure, covenant breach probability, liquidity drag, scenario-weighted downside. She nodded when directors spoke, then looked down too quickly when someone asked her to explain the assumptions behind the revised collateral model. The first time she answered, she repeated a sentence Preston had used 2 days earlier. The second time, a junior risk officer corrected her. The third time, she stopped speaking before the end of her own sentence. That was the moment she understood the cruelty of the gift Preston had given her. He had not handed her power. He had handed her exposure. A board seat did not make her strategic. A proxy did not make her informed. A white dress did not protect her from numbers that had no interest in beauty, proximity, or charm. Across the table, directors who once smiled politely at her began addressing questions to the CFO instead. The CFO began answering with hesitation. The hesitation spread. Soon, hesitation became market perception. Within 6 weeks, Blackwell Meridian's acquisition rating was downgraded. 2 institutional investors paused commitments, and a family office in Chicago withdrew $96 million from a pending co-investment vehicle. Preston summoned consultants, but they rebuilt only the surface of what Camille had taken with her. They could imitate dashboards. They could not imitate judgment. They could recreate formulas. They could not recreate the woman who knew when a beautiful number was lying. At night, Preston stayed alone in his office, reading old board notes, where Camille had written tiny comments in the margins. Too optimistic, recheck guarantor, hidden rollover risk, ask for collateral schedule. He had once found those notes irritating. Now they looked like warnings from a future he had chosen to insult. When Aldwych Federal Trust finally issued a formal restructuring notice, Preston stood at the window with the paper in his hand and said nothing. Behind him, Bianca sat very still, her borrowed confidence folding inward. The empire did not collapse because Camille left. It collapsed because everyone finally saw she had been holding it up. The meeting at Aldwych Federal Trust was scheduled for 10:30 a.m. And nobody called it a surrender, though every document on the table knew better. The private restructuring room sat behind 2 security doors on the 42nd floor, sealed away from reporters, junior analysts, and the kind of public humiliation Preston Blackwell had spent his adult life avoiding. There were no chandeliers, no floral arrangements, no champagne glasses, and no stage where a man could smile his way through failure. Just a long walnut table, 12 leather chairs, a wall screen filled with collateral schedules, and a silent row of bankers who understood that distressed assets did not care about ego. Preston arrived first in a black suit that still fit perfectly, though the man inside it looked diminished by sleeplessness. Bianca Fairchild sat beside him in a white dress, her posture careful, her hands folded over a folder she had not opened since entering the room. Months earlier, she had sat in Camille's board seat believing proximity to power would make her powerful. Now she sat beside the consequences, trying not to breathe too loudly. When Camille Everhart entered, the room changed, without anyone announcing it. She wore a vivid red dress beneath a structured black coat, her hair swept cleanly back, her portfolio tucked beneath one arm, and her expression calm enough to make every nervous person in the room feel suddenly overexposed. She did not look at Preston first. She greeted the Aldwych managing director, nodded to the restructuring council, placed her materials on the table, and took the seat assigned to Everhart Risk Atelier, directly across from the man who had once tried to erase her vote. The seating chart itself felt like a verdict. This time, no one was pretending she was in formal support. This time, her name was printed on the agenda in bold, Lead Quantitative Risk Advisor. Preston's eyes flicked to the paper, then to Camille, and something in his face tightened. Recognition is most painful when it arrives too late. The managing director opened the session by stating that Aldwych Federal Trust had retained Camille's firm to review the collateral pool backing Blackwell Meridian's emergency financing request. Preston's jaw flexed, but he said nothing. He could not object, without admitting that the woman he had tried to legally corner was now the person the bank trusted to measure what remained of his empire. Camille connected her laptop, and the first slide appeared, a clean valuation map separating viable assets, impaired holdings, covenant-sensitive debt, and non-recoverable exposure. Her voice was steady as she explained that Blackwell Meridian's portfolio had not failed because of one market shock. It had failed because the firm repeatedly overvalued assets, understated liquidity drag, and ignored guarantor concentration after losing its core risk controls. She did not insult Preston. She did not mention marriage. She did not need to. Every number did it for her. One by one, she walked the room, through the damage, a warehouse fund priced 18% above realistic recovery value, a credit facility carrying rollover risk Preston's team had missed, a coastal property bundle dependent on tenants already seeking exits, and a merger assumption, so optimistic that Aldwych's counsel removed his glasses halfway, through the slide, and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Bianca looked smaller with every chart. At one point, Camille asked her to confirm whether the board had reviewed the counterparty concentration schedule before approving the revised acquisition exposure. Bianca opened her folder, found the wrong tab, then looked to Preston. The silence that followed was not loud, but it was complete. Camille waited 3 seconds, then continued without mercy and without cruelty. That was what made it devastating. Preston had once controlled rooms by making people feel they needed his approval. Camille now controlled this one by making approval irrelevant. When her presentation ended, Aldwych's managing director turned to Preston and said the bank would consider financing only under a forced asset sale structure, with Everhart Risk Atelier advising the buyer group on valuation integrity. Preston's face lost its last practiced calm. The same institution he had approached for rescue had brought Camille in to price the pieces. She closed her laptop, folded her hands, and finally looked directly at him. The room where he had expected mercy had become a mirror. And for the first time, Preston Blackwell had to sit still while Camille Everhart decided what his name was worth. After the Aldwych team stepped out to confer, Preston asked for 5 minutes alone with Camille. He did not look at the bankers when he said it, and he did not look at Bianca either, because desperation has a way of making witnesses feel expensive. The managing director glanced at Camille, not Preston, and that small shift of permission landed harder than any insult could have. Camille considered the request, with the calm of someone evaluating a clause, then nodded once. Bianca remained seated for half a second too long, as if she still belonged inside the conversation, but Preston's silence told her the truth before anyone else had to. She gathered her unopened folder and left the room, with the careful dignity of a woman realizing that the chair she had won had become the place where her ignorance was recorded. When the door closed, Preston stayed standing near the end of the walnut table. His black suit was still immaculate, his cuff links still silver, his shoes still polished, but the architecture of the man had changed. The old Preston filled rooms because people allowed him to borrow their certainty. This Preston had run out of borrowed things. "Camille," he said, and for the first time in years, her name sounded less like possession and more like a plea. She did not answer immediately. She opened her portfolio, removed the 3-page valuation summary, and placed it between them. The gesture was quiet, almost courteous, and that made it worse. Preston looked at the document, then back at her. "You know what this does to the company," he said. Camille held his gaze. "Yes." He swallowed, and she saw the calculation behind his eyes, the old instinct searching for the right emotional door. Memory, guilt, admiration, history. We built this together, he said. There were years when it was just us. You remember that? You remember the late nights, the first office, the first fund, the first time we thought we might actually win. For one brief second, Camille did remember. She remembered the cheap desk, with one broken drawer, the takeout cartons beside risk models, the younger version of Preston, who still asked questions, before pretending to know answers. She remembered believing partnership could survive ambition. Then she remembered the proxy sliding across the boardroom table. The memory closed. We did build something, she said. Then you tried to prove I was optional. Preston stepped closer, but not too close. Even now, he understood the room had rules he no longer controlled. I made a mistake. Camille's expression did not change. No, a mistake is a wrong cell in a model. A mistake is a missed signature page. What you did required counsel, timing, board coordination, and the confidence that I would absorb the humiliation quietly enough for your merger to proceed. He looked away first. Outside the glass wall, Aldwych attorneys moved through the corridor like shadows, with billing codes. Preston lowered his voice. What do you want? Camille almost smiled, but there was no warmth in it. That question came too late. He spread his hands, and there it was, the final performance of a man trying to make surrender look like negotiation. He offered to restore her board seat. He offered to revoke Bianca's proxy. He offered a public correction, a private settlement, a licensing premium, even a strategic partnership under her firm's name, if she would advise Aldwych to soften the forced sale discount. Each offer sounded generous only if a person forgot who had created the value being bargained with. Camille turned the valuation summary toward him and tapped the second page. Your company is not being discounted because I am angry. It is being discounted because your collateral pool is impaired, your liquidity assumptions are indefensible, your merger thesis failed stress review, and your board approved risk it did not understand. Her voice remained even. That is not revenge, Preston. That is pricing. His face tightened at the word. Pricing had once been her gift to him. Now it was her boundary. You could save it, he said. Camille looked at the man in the black suit, at the name that had once been attached to her future, at the empire that had mistaken her devotion for infrastructure. She felt no triumph. Triumph would have meant he still mattered too much. What she felt was cleaner, colder, and freer. I already saved it, she said. For 5 years. You called it instinct when investors applauded. You called it support when reporters asked. You called it confidential property when I walked away. Preston's mouth opened, then closed. There was no elegant sentence left for him to wear. Camille stood and gathered her portfolio. You did not lose me when the lawyers divided the marriage, Preston. You lost me the moment you thought my silence meant I was replaceable. She walked to the door, then paused with her hand on the handle. A proxy can transfer a vote, she said. It cannot transfer judgment. When she stepped back into the corridor, Aldwych's managing director was waiting with the revised term sheet. Camille accepted it, signed her initials beside the valuation integrity clause, and returned the pen. Through the glass, Preston remained alone at the table, staring at 3 pages that explained in perfect arithmetic how a man could own a company on paper and still lose to the woman who understood its truth. What happened after that was not loud enough for people who confused justice with spectacle. There was no dramatic press conference, no public collapse across a ballroom, no scene designed for strangers to clap at another person's ruin. Blackwell Meridian Capital entered a controlled restructuring under Aldwych Federal Trust supervision, and Everhart Risk Atelier advised the buyer group, with the same precision Camille had once given away in silence. Viable assets were separated from vanity holdings. Debt was marked honestly. Inflated projections were stripped of their expensive perfume. Preston kept a smaller version of the company, but not the illusion that had protected him. Bianca resigned from the advisory seat within 3 weeks, citing personal reasons in a statement, so polished it nearly disappeared while being read. People expected Camille to enjoy that part. She did not. By then, she had learned something more durable than victory. When you finally reclaim your own value, you stop needing someone else's downfall to prove it was real. Months later, Camille stood in the new Everhart Risk Atelier office, on the same floor where Preston's expansion team had once planned to lease executive suites before the merger failed. Her firm had not bought the space to mock him. It had bought the space because the terms were favorable, the location was strategic, and the conference rooms faced east, where morning light entered before anyone could pretend the day belonged to them. On the wall outside the main analysis room, Camille had one rule engraved in small brass letters: credit is part of compensation. Every analyst who entered saw it. Every client who visited read it. No one in her company would have their intellect hidden behind a louder person's title. She still kept the old green fountain pen in her desk, not because she missed Preston, but because it reminded her of the woman who had once mistaken endurance for love. She did not hate that woman. She honored her, then outgrew her. And you see, that is the part of Camille Everhart's story that matters most. This was never simply about a husband, a mistress, or a stolen voting proxy. It was about the quiet violence of being used, without being named, trusted without being credited, needed without being respected. Preston believed power was a chair at the head of the table. Bianca believed power was being invited to sit beside him. Camille learned that power was the ability to stand up, take back your mind, protect your work, and build a table where no one had to disappear to make someone else look brilliant. Tell me, what would you do if someone tried to take your voice and hand it to someone else? Would you fight forever for the old seat, or would you become so undeniable that the room had to reorganize around your absence? Camille chose the second path. She did not leave to be rescued. She did not rise to be forgiven. She left because dignity sometimes begins with one handwritten sentence, one declined phone call, one invoice no one expected, and one decision to stop donating genius to people who call it loyalty. Power is not the chair you sit in. Power is what happens when you stand up and the whole room loses its balance. This story is a fictional narrative created for entertainment, reflection, and educational purposes. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental.